Dear church, let's talk about cross-cultural evangelism. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley, joined today by my good friend, Chase Turner, all the way from Louisiana. Chase, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Hey, it is my pleasure. Love Dear Church podcast. Love being around you, even though it's digital. So I appreciate the opportunity to get to visit.
Yeah, we need to get together more. I see you in passing 2 or 3 times a year, and love you, love your family. Those who don't know Bob Turner, Chase's dad, he's been a friend of the show as well. Chase is a multi-talented guy. We've had him on in the past talking about a book that he wrote called Trials. We're having him on today to talk about cross-cultural evangelism because this is something that you are near and dear to. I know you are bilingual. And this is something you participate in and spend a lot of time with. And so I thought who better to have on to talk about this subject than you. But before we jump into that, talk a little bit about what's going on in your world, your beautiful wife and your 58 kids. Is that right?
57, but I probably missed one, so there might be 58 of them.
Tell us about your family. What's going on in your world right now?
Well, we are 17 years into marriage, 4 kids, 14, 12, 11, and 6. And so no one told me when you had 4 kids and they get involved in one extracurricular piece that you would have virtually no time to yourself anymore. So we've got one that's a very talented singer, one that's an artist, others that look like they're going to be an engineer, and one that runs the show and everybody does what he says. So the 6-year-old seems to have everybody at his beck and call sometimes. But now we're doing well, plugged in with local work and work around the world. And I've been working with the Herald of Truth since January on some really neat things that we'll discuss here in a little bit relative to our topic today.
Yeah. So you're in West Monroe and been there for how long now?
12 years, maybe. Somewhere around there. We moved a couple different places here in Monroe when we first got started. But yeah, we've been here for about 12 years.
Yeah. And I know the work is going well. And talk a little bit about what you do on a daily basis, both with Herald of Truth and then your other things that you're doing.
So the Herald of Truth since January, one of their primary focuses was going to be helping Hispanics train Hispanics in the U.S., And one of the important things for us when you think about the amount of growing Hispanic population is not just reaching them, but teaching them to reach others. And so that's been a primary focus with what we've been doing with them. In addition to starting next year, we're going to be doing some international mission trips and trying to plug some churches in the U.S. around that want to do some short-term stuff as well. And then the Truth Digital media stuff we've got going on with the radio that we're going to be broadcasting 24/7. And then locally, just trying to help the Hispanics. If you teach people, hey, you need to reach Hispanics around your area, then it would make sense for us to do that here as well. And so just trying to plug in with the Hispanic community, seeing what their physical needs are, meeting those, and then sharing Jesus with them at the same time. So it's been a good thing, good ministry, and a lot of fun.
Yeah. And of course, certainly helps that you are bilingual. That has been kind of your wheelhouse for quite some time. Talk a little bit about what the church has done effectively through the years to reach the Hispanic population in our communities, and maybe just those who are foreigners coming into our country and helping them with evangelism.
I think one of the most effective things that the church has done, or at least parts of the church have done, because it can be a challenge to learn a second language, is exactly that, showing the Hispanic culture that we care about them includes learning their language. And there are some things like love that's a universal language. And so just being welcoming, a smile, those kinds of things, I think we've been effective in being kind to people. Learning their language is also a huge barrier to overcome, because even if you speak just a little bit of broken Spanish, it really speaks volumes that they at least took some time to learn a little bit about my language, maybe my culture, to invite me in. And I think effectively too, trying to do some bilingual services, trying to incorporate some Spanish related things into either a Sunday service or some kind of midweek outreach get-togethers has been effective, I think, so far.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, the language barrier is one of the bigger obstacles when it comes to what we're titling cross-cultural evangelism. What are some other obstacles? And I'm sure our viewers and listeners can chime in here with some obstacles that they have faced. But just trying to reach our foreign neighbors, what are some other obstacles that you've seen that really hinder that effort?
I think stereotypes are one of the biggest. I think in U.S. culture, a lot of people live on a clock. And so when I tell you I'll be there at 9 o'clock, if I'm not there at 9 o'clock, somebody's mad that they have to wait because we value our time. I think our time is one of our greatest assets. And in a lot of Hispanic culture, if they say we'll be there at 9, a lot of people, have your different time zones, and they'll label Latin Standard Time as one of those times, jokingly, but there's some truth to it and maybe some tension there because typically they're not on time. And there's some Americans well, but they're kind of known for that. And so I think one of the barriers from the Anglo side is, well, they're just never on time. So I can't ever figure out, we'll make excuses about why we can't do things, language, being the first one you mentioned, time frame, and just, I think some other general stereotypes that some may be true, some may not be true, but it's our perception of looking at people. Well, you get into the immigration status and those kinds of things. And, I don't think it's our job to be detectives on a lot of those things. A lot of hurdles come when we think, well, they're probably not here legally, so I'm just not going to do anything except try to get them back to their country of origin. Those things are not helpful at all, and those can be big obstacles.
Yeah. When you go and do foreign mission work, and I've done very little, but I've been to El Salvador, been to Mexico City several times, you do notice that our culture seems to be the main one that focuses on the clock and time and being on time. Everywhere else I've been, there doesn't seem to be a huge premium placed on that. And, you see it in the worship service when you go to like Mexico City and you engage with the Metro Church of Christ and you see that, they may start at 9, they may start at 10, and it's not an hour service with a hard stop. It may be 3 or 4 hours. They may get up and eat during the service, so you do have to adapt and adjust. I think we talked about this with Chad Garrett, one of our ministers on staff here, who's done a lot of mission work a few months ago. And we talked about it being able to adapt and adjust and not Americanize, those churches in other places. We want to go over there and we want to give them the American culture and make it an Americanized church. And that's just not how this works. But you do have to give and take a little bit, right? Where's the point where you say, you've just got to come up to our way of doing things or else it's not going to work. We do have to be able to kind of soften and say, hey, we'll work with you in your time frame as well, right?
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because one of the other hurdles that I see in foreign missions is trying to Americanize churches all over the world, whether it's Hispanic or elsewhere. Yeah. And we go down and we try to create an Anglo church in another country. Well, the same is true here. We try to reach out to Hispanics and even starting a Spanish-speaking church and think, well, you guys have to do it like we do it on the other side of the building or in our other location, whatever. And that doesn't work either. Right. I would say the greatest obstacle I've had to overcome in our local outreach is the way that Hispanics stereotype Americans. And a lot of times we look at the stereotypes we place on them, and we have some locals, and I've talked to them about trying to reach out, and they will tell people, you should come to our church. We have a preacher that speaks good Spanish. He helps us find work, and he teaches the Bible, not his opinion. Like that, they think a lot of me, and I appreciate that. I was like, you don't, tell people to come because you love them. We want to create a family atmosphere. And the number one question they get is, well, what does he get out of it? And they'll tell them nothing. Like he doesn't ask us for anything. And even with like, can be a touchy subject, but like with giving, I've never asked the Hispanic church for an offering because we don't have any bills.
Yep.
And so if there is a need, we'll take up a collection. If somebody comes and says, hey, I can't get groceries, we will take up an offering and help provide those needs. But we don't see the need for our small, really poor demographic to store money in a bank account of any sort if there's not a need that's specific, because when a need rises up, they meet it. And so the other people, when they ask, well, what does he get out of it? And they say, absolutely nothing. They say, I don't believe you. And so there is a stereotype of Americans in that they think we always have an ulterior motive to helping them because they've been burned enough times. If they're labor workers and somebody says, hey, I have this job, can you do it? And they give them a price. Well, they try to beat them down on the price because they think they can get cheaper labor from a Spanish-speaking person. And so there's a stereotype against Americans, too, that hinders reaching them. So it can be a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. Talk a little bit about what we are doing currently, because I think, I've talked to a lot of Christians that, they say, well, our community has a lot of Hispanic folks and we want to reach them. We want to, try to evangelize that community, but they're kind of at a loss of what to do, especially if they don't know the language. They don't have anybody in their church that can speak the language. Talk a little bit about some things that we are doing that you have seen, and especially those things that are effective.
I think one of the most effective things we can do as a church is training Hispanics to reach Hispanics. And the reason that has been effective, I think is the key, is because a local Hispanic work needs to have the face of a Hispanic. Because of the stereotype that Hispanics put on Americans, if they see their own people reaching out to them here, that's going to be effective. You can get rid of the language barrier and you get rid of a lot of the stereotype. And so that's part of it. The other part of it, effective work that we can do, is being a support system for the Hispanics to reach Hispanics. And so from an Anglo side, I say, hey, I don't have the language, but we have a food pantry. We have a clothing pantry. Yeah. Offer those things to the Hispanics that are reaching Hispanics. And so I tell people, we've done a lot of church planting and Spanish ministry enhancing in the last year. And anytime I have a meeting with church leadership, I'll ask them, you need at least one. Do you have one person that's bilingual or just a Spanish speaker that you can work with to reach out? You've got to know what your human resources are, because if you say we have a food pantry and a clothing pantry, we have no way to get them to people, well, then it's ineffective. But if you'll figure out your human resources first, and primarily, like I said, you need a Hispanic looking face. If you have that, then providing them with resources. No resources may be ESL classes at your church. It may be just a Bible class, food, clothing, some kind of benevolent program, whatever that is that can your Hispanic face or a person can say to their people in their community, hey, this is what we have to offer. And none of what we've mentioned so far is the scripture. It's scripture in action, but it's not, hey, you have to have a Bible in your hand when you reach these people, because the old saying's so true. They don't care at all what you know until they know how much you care. And so being the hands and feet in Jesus in a very practical way first, which is something I think the church has been good at. They've been very generous in supplying those resources. It's just a matter of getting over some of those other barriers we talked about to build a relationship.
Yeah, you talk to missionaries that have been very effective in mission work, and they will say that the real goal of mission work should be to make it indigenous, so that you go to Ghana or you go to, a foreign country and you say, we're going to build something here, and through our evangelistic efforts, we're eventually going to turn it over to the people and leave it with them. The goal is not to have a white man come over and be the preacher for 50 years. The goal is to raise up leaders and preachers and things like that from their own people so that the church is indigenous. What I hear you saying is that's really the goal here as well, rather than having kind of a Hispanic population attached to the church where, you've got the regular church and the Hispanic church. You're trying to make it indigenous, where you have a Hispanic preacher leading the Hispanic people, and they are their own congregation. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yes, it's incredibly difficult to merge two cultures into one service. I won't say into one church, because I think we all agree there is one church. And so there's a church in Lake Dallas. Andy Chavarria is the preacher there, and they do a pretty effective job of merging the two at least twice a month. They'll have a bilingual service, but by and large, they'll split up for their services to where one's in the back of the building, one's in the front. And, you can get into arguments with people about, well, that's splitting the church or whatever. I really don't engage in those kinds of conversations, because each church leadership has to decide for themselves, hey, are we going to try and make this work, and getting their people on board with that? My experience has been, do activities together, do family things together, do outreach together. But when it comes to your actual service, it's less chaotic to have a split service, so to speak, one in English, one in Spanish. One of the things from a structure standpoint that I've seen be effective is have your Bible class time at the same time, so that the kids can come together. If the goal for the Hispanics is for their kids to learn English, well, having English classes with the Anglo group at the same time is good for their kids. It's also a time where they can have some more direct time with other members, and not have to worry about their kids while they're a fellowship with other people. And then during the service, I encourage our Hispanics to go to the English services when we're not having Spanish services, whether it's a nighttime service or whatever that looks like, if they're looking to learn English. And so if one of our outreach is ESL classes, and in Green Bay, one of the Mesa churches that we've planted, Mesa stands for Mission Evangelize Spanish America. Their preacher is fully bilingual. He's from Costa Rica, and he started doing ESL classes, he and his wife, on Friday nights. And they have kind of a bilingual, but then also a split service on Sunday. And I think they've had in just a couple of months 6 from those ESL classes that have not missed a worship service on Sunday. And so it's a very effective tool to teach them English, and then say, here's a way to practice. Come to services and put into practice what we're studying Friday nights. And so tying your outreach to your time of service is also a good tool to build relationship and application of what they're learning.
Yeah, I think that we always feel like the goal is I mentioned this before, is to bring them under our purview and to count them as part of our congregation. So, I've said it before, we like to count, and we like to have the numbers. And but I think what you're saying is, to be the most effective, let it be indigenous. Let them have the congregation that is tailored to them, because it is less chaotic having this, interpretation and all that kind of stuff. Doesn't mean you still can't do fellowship activities together, still can't be together at times. But I like what you're saying there. We've already kind of hit on it, but talk about some other ways that we can make this most effective. If we're going to do cross-cultural evangelism, what are some things that we can do to ensure, well, maybe not ensure, but at least to give ourselves a good start in being more effective?
I think from an Anglo standpoint, we really have to train the Anglos in a supportive role and make sure that our Anglo group understands the need, but then also how they can play a role. I think you have different groups. One of the things I noticed here, we had a senior citizens group that I had 2 of them didn't know they speak Spanish. And sometimes they feel like because they're older, they're ineffective, or there's not a place for them. And so finding different groups within the church where, if part of your outreach is, hey, we can give rides to people that don't have cars. And so finding different ways to implement people into ministry where, if language is a barrier, but you have a car, well, then we can do the communication part. If you can be wheels for somebody to get kids to a doctor's appointment, that's a great way to connect people within that outreach. Make sure Anglo population, whatever part of that church, feel, hey, there's something I can do. Same with your youth group kind of people. really speaking to them about, hey, there are some kids that need some friends. They're second generation, third generation. They're Hispanic. They may not even speak Spanish. But one of the real challenges, I think, in any kind of cross-cultural outreach is racism. And so making sure that our English-speaking people don't have any racial tendencies, even if it's indirect or they don't even notice, just having some pretty transparent conversations. If we're going to get involved in cross-cultural, what are some of your concerns? And having those conversations with your members, what are your concerns about us doing this? And so before you even start, making sure everybody's on the same page, addressing any issues, because we had a guy several years ago, he just wanted to have the conversation, but nobody was having the conversation with him. And we were afraid he was going to call, immigration and come to our services. And it was like, you can't do that. And so I set aside some time to meet with him. And I said, look, one of our places in Scripture is doing justice and making sure we're reaching out to everybody in our area. And foreigners are one of those groups of people. And our job is to evangelize and to build relationship, not to deport. That's not our responsibility. And he had a very open conversation. And then the next week, he brought me $100 and said, please feed one of these families or a couple of these families. And so it's just a matter of having the conversation with somebody who had some concerns. We addressed those concerns. And then he was 100% on board. In fact, he probably gave more to this outreach than anybody else locally has because somebody took the time to hear him. And so I think having those conversations with our different ministry staff or groups, depending on the size of the church, to make sure everybody's on board and all their concerns are addressed.
I think that's a really good point. I think that we live in a highly politicized culture, and we make sweeping generalizations, no matter what the topic is. Immigration's a big topic now, closing the border and all that. And so we tend to stereotype, we tend to pigeonhole people, we tend to make generalizations and say, well, these people or those people, illegally coming over here or whatever. And we can't see the forest for the trees, and we can't see the soul because of the issue. And unfortunately, that hinders our evangelism efforts. And I love what you're saying there is, look, they need the gospel. Regardless of anything else, they need the gospel. And that is our number one duty and responsibility. I think maybe this should have been the question we asked at the beginning, but we'll close with it instead. Chase, why? Why is this important? I think we know why, but frame the discussion for us by saying, this is why we need cross-cultural evangelism.
Wow, I think there's a couple of underlying reasons why it's so important. I'll get into the scriptural part of that in just a second. But cross-cultural evangelism, Americans right now are making up a smaller and smaller and smaller demographic here. And if we're not reaching out past our own culture, there is a huge unreached population that, one, don't see Jesus if they don't see the evangelistic effort. And a lot of them may not know him at all. And so I think the populace is one of the biggest reasons why, is because there's a huge opportunity and group that needs to be reached. But just from a scriptural standpoint, when I started reading through the Sermon on the Mount about a year ago, a lot. That was my focus, especially started January this year. I read through Matthew 5, 6, and 7 every day through June. And one of the things I noticed was the Greek word we use for righteousness is the same Greek word translated justice. And when you translate it justice, it carries a lot heavier weight when you think about seek ye first his kingdom and his justice in Matthew 6. And the word justice really had to do with how the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner were treated. And so Jesus was really hard on the Pharisees because they neglected taking care of those three people groups. Mm-hmm. And so the reason why, I think, is if Jesus was here today physically, I think his primary concern would be reaching those three people groups, not the wealthy, not the quote unquote righteous, not the people that knew the Bible the best. But his outreach, I think, would be helping the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner. And it's not just helping them in a tangible way, but helping them spiritually. That is our primary concern. But the way that Jesus went about doing that was feeding people, healing people, and talking to people. And so the why for me is it's what Jesus did. That's what I should be doing. Why do you? It's because it's what Jesus did, and I believe it's what he would do, is reaching out to these people groups. Now, Jesus wouldn't have a language barrier. And so again, he would find ways around those barriers, whatever they might be. And I think we have an obligation and a responsibility to do the same, is to not make excuses and say there's a growing population of people that need Jesus. How do we do that? We know why, is because eternity matters. It matters for us. It matters for them. How do we reach them? And that's a lot of what we talk today, is how do we do that? The why is because there's souls at stake. Eternity matters.
Yeah, the Great Commission is to go into all the world, and the world's coming to us. We talk all the time about, I say we talk all the time, I've heard it, I'm sure you've heard it, is why are we going thousands of miles across the globe when we've got people in our own backyard? Well, it's not an either or, right? I mean, you can do both, but we do have people in our own backyard that come from a foreign country that need to be reached. It's kind of like sometimes you have to make great effort, and you should, to reach people with the gospel. Sometimes, you bump your cart into the tree and the fruit falls right in it. And that's kind of where we're at today, right? I mean, what we're talking about is the people in our own backyard that have come our way that need evangelizing. And you've got to overcome the obstacles. But one of the big obstacles is you don't have to travel across the country or across the globe. You've got it right here, an opportunity. And I'm so thankful for what you're doing in taking advantage of that opportunity. And just take a little time here as we close to kind of talk about some ways that other people can get involved. You mentioned Mesa, which is a great work. I want you to talk a little bit more about that, and also Herald Truth, and then how others can get involved in helping with this effort.
Sure. So the Herald of Truth, their tagline is sharing the story of Jesus, which is one of the things that attracted me to the organization, is that is the primary focus. And so Mesa was something they specifically brought me on board to do, is to help Spanish outreach in the U.S. And any church, I would love to visit with any leadership that's interested in either starting a Spanish outreach or has one but needs some more resources, wants to visit about how to be more effective. I've been fortunate to visit with a handful of churches here in the U.S., and even some have reached out from Nicaragua and Costa Rica about Mesa, which is funny because the A stands for America. But anybody that wants to visit about that, we have a lot of resources. Online Bible training program. It's on escuelabiblica.online. It's a free way to study the Bible in Spanish. If you're learning Spanish or you want to learn the Bible in Spanish, that is a great free resource. You can study at your own pace on your phone, on a computer. But Mesa in general is just for any church that wants to do Spanish outreach. And we're very hands-on. And so if we need to make a trip, we'll make a trip. If we need to set up a Zoom, we'll set up a Zoom. But evangelism and sharing Jesus with people is that primary focus for that. In addition, kind of related to that, our international work, we go to Honduras in June. Anybody that would want to do a short-term mission trip, we have tons of space. And so if youth group, well, I'll say youth group, there better be a good youth leader, because taking big groups, it can be a challenge. But anybody that wants to get their feet wet in Honduras, it's very safe. We have a great place to stay and really do some house building, people feeding, Jesus sharing there. Would love to take anybody that wants to go on those trips. But yeah, the Herald of Truth has been really good. 70 years they've been around, 71 years, just sharing Jesus with people and finding the different ways to do that in the U.S. and abroad is something that I've been thankful to be a part of just the past year. And so it's been a great work, and God continues to just really show out through the success of that work.
Yeah. Well, I want to let our viewers and listeners know that if you have any more questions about anything that we've talked about today, specifically the ministries that Chase is involved in, you can email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com, and we'll make sure to forward that to Chase. Chase, do you have an email where people can reach you?
I do. Chase@heraldoftruth.org. And I answer pretty quickly most of the time. I sit in front of the computer most of the time looking for ways to do outreach with Hispanics. So love to help anybody that has a question.
That's awesome. Hey, Chase, thanks for joining us today, and I really appreciate what you're doing, man.
Hey, thank you, Chris. Really enjoy the opportunity to get to visit with you, but also to tell your listeners about the great things we're doing.
Absolutely. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.